Hello, and welcome to Central Booking, where writers and readers are the authority. I'm your host, John Valeri. Today's episode has been a long time in the making. Edwin Hill and I first planned to talk in December, but much like the books I read and the ones he writes, there were a few plot twists that complicated things. Fortunately, those have since resolved, and we can now return to our regularly scheduled programming. Edwin's latest book, Watch Her, is the third in his critically acclaimed series featuring Hester Thursby, a 4'9" Harvard librarian whose knack for digging into things often extends beyond the library and into missing persons and murder cases. A Massachusetts native, Edwin graduated from Connecticut's Wesleyan University with a degree in American Studies and later earned an MFA from Emerson College in Boston. A long career in educational publishing followed, and he ultimately served as vice president and editorial director for Bedford St. Martin's before deciding to pursue writing full-time. The eventual result was 2018's Little Comfort, the first Hester Thursby book, which was nominated for an Agatha Award for Best First Novel. The Missing Ones followed a year later and was nominated for both the G.P. Putnam's Sons Sue Grafton Memorial Award and the Agatha Award for Best Contemporary Novel. Watch Her, which finds Hester embroiled in the world of academia and a prominent family with secrets to keep, follows in that tradition. Publishers Weekly gave the book a rave review, noting, "Quirky characters complement the suspenseful plot. Readers will agree that a failing school makes a grade A mystery." It's fitting praise, given that Edwin Hill is not only a purveyor of craft, but also a teacher of it. Eyes forward and ears open, my friends, because you're about to get an education from somebody who's in a class all his own. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Central Booking. Today, I am in the virtual company of Mr. Edwin Hill, who is the author of the Hester Thursby Mystery Series, critically acclaimed, beloved by readers, award nominated as well. And the third book in that series, Watch Her, is out now. It actually came out in December, so I'm really excited to have you on the show. Edwin, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, John, thanks so much for having me today.
'Tis my pleasure. We were talking before we started recording, and it's like, things have finally come together. I think this has been in the making for something like 3 months now, which is just nuts.
Oh yeah, life gets in the way once in a while, doesn't it? And
Yep,
right. I think we both had a few things on our plate.
Yes, we had a few real life plot twists, but here we are. And I'm really excited to be talking to you because I have to say, Hester Thursby, I have just come to love her. I feel like, she's one of sort of the more compelling characters that's emerged in crime fiction recently. So it's always interesting for me to, come to your books and see what she's up to. And so we're going to talk about Watch Her in a little bit, but I thought maybe we could start a little bit more generally and talk about Hester as a character and sort of how she developed, because she's very distinct. It's kind of funny. She's small in stature. I think she stands 4'9", but very, sort of big in personality, and she has a really cool job. She's a librarian at Harvard. So, given her background and her physical stature, you'd think that in some ways that can be really helpful to her sleuthing, and in other ways it can kind of complicate things. So I was wondering if you can tell us about that, and just more generally or more broadly, how her character developed and came to be who she is now.
Oh, sure. So Hester came to me through fits and starts. I mean, I think any author will tell you, you spend a really long, or well, I did at least. I spent a really long time on my first novel. And, it was both sort of finding the self-confidence to write my first novel, but also just feeling my way through the whole process of writing the first novel. So my first novel is called Little Comfort, and it was inspired by a local case that happened up here in Boston involving this guy named Clark Rockefeller, for anyone who remembers him. So he was a guy who pretended to be a member of the Rockefeller clan, and it turned out he wasn't a member of the Rockefeller clan. But for a long time, he had pretended that he was. He married a very wealthy woman. They lived on Beacon Hill in Boston. And when his story started to unravel, he went on the run with his young daughter. And I saw that story and I thought it was really an interesting story. And I thought, I'm going to write a novel based on this guy. And I wanted to write a novel about an anti-hero. And so my first novel is about this guy named Sam Blaine, who basically does what Rockefeller does. He infiltrates other people's lives. And so when I started that book, Hester wasn't even in the book. The book was about Sam Blaine. And I was just kind of going in fits and starts. And I wrote for a while, and the novel wasn't going anywhere. And finally, I decided I needed a protagonist. I was like, I'm not, this anti-hero thing's not working for me. So I needed a protagonist. And so Sam, in that book, Sam has a sidekick named Gabe. And so it was two guys. And my whole thought process around, I mean, this is how Hester Thursby was born. I said to myself, I don't want to write a novel about three guys. So I'm going to add this woman to it. And so I started coming, writing is a series of what if questions. So you say, what if? So my first question was, what if the protagonist is a woman? So I add this woman in. And then so I started adding little details about her. And so I knew she was 36 years old. I knew she had a child. And so then I was like, okay, I've got this woman with a child who's not hers. And so I was like, just for today, because I like to name characters really quickly. Just for today, I'm going to call her Hester, and I'm going to call the child Pearl, which is so pretentious, of course. And so that's from the Scarlet Letter, and that's super pretentious. And so I thought the very next day I woke up and I thought, well, one of these names have got to go. But I was like, I kind of like Hester. I'm going to let that one stick. And so you can see it was just like these fits and starts where I was like coming up with these different things about this woman. And so, one of the things she needed was a job. And so I went through a bunch of different professions for her. I did know that I wanted her to be an amateur sleuth. For a while, the novel was going to be more on the cozy side. These novels they're like psychological thrillers. They're not cozy. So for a while, she was going to be a baker. And then for a while, she was going to be a psychologist. And then there are a lot of books I feel that do psychology really well and much better than I could have done. And so finally, I was walking through Harvard. At the time I lived in Somerville, which runs right alongside Cambridge for anyone who doesn't know the area. So I was walking through Harvard Yard, and I Widener Library, which is the world's largest research library, like appears in front of me. And I thought to myself, librarian. And I thought to myself, well, what do librarians do? A, they have access to all sorts of information, and they have access to information that not the average person has, and they know what to do with the information. And then on top of all of that, they're naturally curious people. And so I thought that would be a really interesting profession to give to this woman. Then I just started to fill out other parts of her life. A few of them come from me. I mean, I'm definitely Hester's crusty. I'm a little crusty. We like our alone time. We express our frustration sometimes. And one of the things when I read reviews about these books, people say that Hester is like endearingly frustrating. And that is exactly what I want to hear about her. And I want her to feel like I want her to make smart decisions. I want her to make dumb decisions. I want her to make selfish decisions. And I just want her to feel very authentic as someone who is trying to navigate through a life.
Sure, and I think that makes her, maybe that's why I respond to her, because she is so real. It's like, sometimes you want to throttle her, but then you're like, that's probably the exact same thing that I would have done, and then look back on it in hindsight and like, you shouldn't have done it. But and it seems fitting too that she came to you in fits and starts, giving her personality. I mean, why should it come easy? But
no, it never. So that first book, for anyone who's listening to this, a first-time reader, you are not the only one who's gone through this. The first book can take a long time.
It's true. Hey, you got there and you found Hester, and that seemed, she's the glue. So it was worth it. But I wanted to actually follow up on something that you said, because you talked about how, Hester, she has a child who is not biologically her. So it's a young girl named Kate, who she and her boyfriend Morgan have raised as their own since Kate's mother sort of skipped town. So I was wondering if you could tell us about, the impact that this role has on Hester, both sort of domestically, but also in terms of her investigations and how that influences what she chooses to do or not do, or how she looks at those things in hindsight that maybe she shouldn't have done.
Oh, sure. So Kate comes to live with Hester and Morgan when she's 3 years old. So she's 3 years old. Everyone ages in this series in real time. So she's 3 years old in the first book, 4 years old in the second book, and 5 years old in the third book. And Hester and Morgan, they age as well. And so Morgan has a twin sister named Daphne who has skipped town and left this child with them. And Hester is 36 years old in this first book, and she has not had children by choice. And she's not thrilled to be saddled with this kid. And meanwhile, Morgan's not helping her out the way he probably should, unbeknownst to her. Only the reader knows that. And so one of the things that Hester in the story arc of these first three books is Hester sort of coming to terms with this thing that has been foisted upon her. I mean, she is an adult. She knows that she has to take care of this kid, but she doesn't necessarily have to be happy about it. And the story arc of these three books is her coming to terms with it and actually finding some joy in it. One of the things I really wanted to do in the third book is bring in the joy of surrogate motherhood for her and have her experience some of that joy. But when in the first book, she has never had a kid before, and she is used to sort of doing whatever she wants. She's a very independent person. Even though she and Morgan have been together for a long time, they actually do things independently of each other a lot of the time. They live in the same house, but they don't live in the same apartment. They sort of travel between each other's apartments. And so all of a sudden she has this kid. Morgan's kind of sort of stepped away a little bit, and she is a little frustrated with the fact that she's been put in this situation. So she winds up bringing Hester along with her into she winds up bringing Kate along with her into a couple of dangerous situations. And part of the process is her figuring out that maybe that isn't something that she should do. And she does it a little less and less as the series goes on.
Sure. And so book three, watch her, which I can actually see over your shoulder. I think half the fun of doing these Zoom things, I get to like check out people's bookshelves, which is always fun, but then I have to remind myself you should probably tune back into the conversation. But so let's pretend, we're stepping into an elevator and I'm going to let you, pitch this book to people who might be watching. And I will just say, I'm going to really distill it down into like a couple points. So basically, Hester becomes embroiled in a case that involves missing persons, murder, academia, and a prominent family with secrets, because is there any other kind? That's
nope.
all. So if we're stepping into that elevator, can you give us the pitch for the book?
Yeah, so this story takes place at a fictional for-profit college based here in Boston called Prescott University. And it starts when one of the owners of the school, there's a break-in at the house of one of the owners of the school. And Hester and her friend, Detective Angela White, are called to the house to investigate the break-in. But as they investigate the break-in, they start to wonder whether someone actually broke in the house or whether the person who is claiming that is making that up. Meanwhile, Hester's hired by the general manager of the school to find some students who've gone missing from their databases. It's seemingly like it's going to be a very easy data mining project. But as Hester digs in, she starts to learn more and more about the students. And as she discovers where these students are, one of them suddenly is killed.
Sure, that was a good pitch.
Why, thank you. There is a deep, deep, dark secret. The family that owns the school has a deep, dark family secret that sort of fuels a lot of their decision making.
Sure. And I wanted to ask you too, I know that some people, are hesitant to come into a series that's sort of in progress. And this is book 3. And I will say, I actually started the series at book 2 and liked it so much that then I went back to book 1 and then shot forward to book 3. And I found that, and you mentioned this a little bit before, there sort of is, an overall story arc that we see evolving, particularly with the character dynamics. But the books also, have singular plots and stand alone quite well. So one, can you talk about, how the books do stand alone, and also, what that's like to balance the fact that you might have a new audience coming into book 3, but also wanting to satisfy people who've been there all along and not lose narrative momentum?
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's one of the challenges with the series. And this is not my original idea, but one that I've borrowed from someone else. And if I can think of who to give credit to, I will. But I do try to write the books in series of threes so that you almost can enter every basically on book 4 or book 7, book 10, so that you have an arc that kind of covers the 3-book series. So I just kind of finished an arc with this set of 3 books, and I'll start a new one with the next 3 books. But there is an art to it. I mean, I will say, I think Louise Penny puts this really well. She says, you can read any of my books standalone with your head, but if you want to read them with your heart, you should start with the beginning. I mean, there are characters. This is like a TV series. You can come in on any episode of a well-written TV series and kind of understand what's going on and figure out who everyone is. But to really understand the heart and soul of that TV series, you probably have to start earlier on than that. But all of the books I write them so that you are introduced to the characters in a way that you can fully understand them. There are recurring characters besides Hester and Morgan and Kate. So Hester and Morgan have this have sort of a found family that grows as the series goes on. And so one of the decisions that I always have to make as I start a new book is which of the recurring characters is going to step into the background and which of them is going to step into the foreground. So like for this book, in all 3 of the books, Angela White has been a sort of a fan favorite. She's another character that just came out of nowhere. So for this book, I really wanted to make her a prominent, fully realized character in this story. And so she wound up being one of the point of view characters in this one. But, I make all sorts of decisions like that. I try to make the story very self-contained, so it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But I will have little things, like this book has a tiny, tiny little, I hope it's not annoying, and you'll have to tell me, but there's a tiny, tiny little cliffhanger at the end that'll pull you into the next book in the series. But it's not like nothing that happened in the book that I just wrote is dependent on that little cliffhanger.
Right. No, not annoying at all. I liked it. It's just enough to, keep me intrigued and saying, Edwin Hill, why do I have to wait another year? Which probably just means you've done your job really well. But actually, it's funny that you would mention Angela White, because I did want to ask you about her, because she does step forward in this book. And the thing that I found, really interesting was sort of her dynamics with Hester, because they have a personal relationship, then they have this professional relationship. And it's just an interesting juxtaposition, because Angela White is very different, in her personal life than in her professional life. So then when you take these friends and throw them together in a really high tension situation, there's a different dynamic. So I was wondering if you could just speak to the relationship between the 2 of them and how that does change given the circumstances of Watcher.
Oh, sure. Well, let me just a little background on Angela. So she sort of appeared in the first book, which is called Little Comfort, and there was a murder in that book, and I needed a detective, so I made up a detective. And so she kind of came into the story I think she comes in about 2/3 of the way through. And for a while, she didn't even have a name. She was just like the detective there investigating. Then I started giving her more storyline, and then I gave her a couple point of view scenes, and then I built out whole chapters around her. And then one of the things I noticed and this is one of the gratifying things about writing a series, one of the things I noticed when I was touring for that book was that people really responded to her. They were like, we love Hester and we love Angela White too. And, she was maybe like 20 pages of that book. So I thought, okay, so I'd already kind of finished my second book, The Missing Ones, but I thought I'll just go back and revise it and give Angela a part. So I kind of wrote her into that book after I'd already written most of the manuscript. And again, when I was touring for that book, people were like, oh, we really like this Angela White. So I wanted to bring her into this third book and really give her like the full character treatment. I mean, because she was just a very secondary character in the first book and sort of backfilled into the second book, I wanted to fully develop who she was as a character and what that relationship with Hester was. So, I kept asking myself, what is the relationship between these 2 people? So Angela, in this, she's been promoted. She's now a sergeant with the Boston Police. She's kind of a no-nonsense cop and, very good at interrogation. But she's also a very caring person. She has a family life that we explore a little bit in this. And she's someone who I wanted to give her a really complex background. And one that added a lot of texture to her character. So, you know, she's lived all sorts of different places. She's had all sorts of different relationships that we sort of touch on in this that I think, you know, might have surprised the reader a little bit. And I think one of the things that I like to explore between Hester and Angela is what they actually know about each other and what surprises them about each other. So Angela will push Hester because Hester is very reserved about her relationship with Morgan. She is very very reticent about any talk about marriage or like full commitment to him. And so Angela really pushes her on that and really makes her question some of the choices that she's made in her life. Whereas Hester is constantly sort of learning little things about Angela. Like she's kind of surprised that Angela's had like a rocky dating history, let's put it that way. And so I like to sort of get into what the secrets were that they kept about each other and what the surprises that they learned about each other and their reactions to those surprises. That was really how I built the dynamic between the two of them in this.
Sure, and I loved learning more, about Angela because she was sort of a peripheral figure, and then she sort of takes center stage. And like you said, you get to bring in the backstory, and it is kind of surprising. And I feel her character is very sort of timely and of the moment, which I think readers will appreciate once they get to see the nuances of that. And you would also mention, how she sort of looks at Hester's relationship with Morgan, and tries to push that along a little bit maybe. And I wanted to ask you about that because one of my favorite aspects of this book is the fact that, you already mentioned that Hester and Morgan sort of, they're together, but they live separate lives. They do a lot of things independent of one another. And there's a lot that they don't know about each other by choice. And in this book, they sort of start to play this game where every day they, reveal something of themselves to the other person. And I thought that that was phenomenal. And I feel like it works on two levels because it's sort of, deepening their relationship, but it's also giving character development to us as readers. And I was just wondering if you could talk about, what compelled you to do that and how you think that it works both in terms of storytelling as a narrative arc, but also in giving readers just a sort of an organic, better understanding of these characters' lives prior to their meeting and, appearing in these books.
Oh, sure. I was like thrilled when I came up with that idea. I did want to push their relationship along. Again, like thinking about the three novel story arc for their characters, I'd really put in the missing ones, the two of them, I'd really put them through the ringer. That book, I would say that the story arc of the missing ones, which is the second book in the series, goes from very bad to like a glimmer of hope at the very end. I mean, it's definitely a very dark novel, and I wanted to give them a sense of light at the end for this third book, and give them a reason to sort of stay together. And so I really wanted to make that a sort of a central piece of this novel, and for them to really stay together, I felt like I needed to push their relationship beyond this one where they were both keeping each other at bay. And so I came up with this for a while. I was going to call this novel "Ask Me Anything," but there are a lot of novels called "Ask Me Anything," and so I didn't use that title. But they play this game. Morgan comes up with this game where they can ask each other one question per day, and whatever the question is, they have to answer it. And a lot of the questions are really mundane because and part of the goal of this is to show that they don't know like really basic things about each other. Like one of the first questions that they ask each other is, "What was your first job?" And they've been dating for like 9 years at this point, and they don't know that. And so they share with each other what their first job is. And then Hester actually reveals, after she shares what her first job was, which was babysitting, she reveals that the job was much deeper than just babysitting, that there's a much deeper story behind the babysitting and sort of what it meant to her as a child to be that babysitter. And sort of some things that she did in the house. Like, of course, if you know Hester, you know that the moment you leave her alone in your house, she searches through your drawers, especially a adolescent child, Hester. So anyway, so even as Hester was revealing things about herself, she was still holding things back, which I thought was really which revealed a lot about her character. But then, of course, as the novel goes on, she holds less back as they play the game.
Sure. Yeah, I love that. I thought it was really clever. So well done, sir.
Thank you.
Yeah, and let me ask you too. So you talked about you talked before, you mentioned, that this book, it does alternate perspectives, and it also, it shifts time frames. We go back in time and then we come, to contemporary times again. So I wanted to ask you, what appeals to you about that structure, and what are the benefits of structuring a book like that, and how do you weigh that sort of against the complexities when it comes to plotting and actually pulling all those pieces together, because it's not linear storytelling.
No, it's not. It's like three-dimensional storytelling, sort of. I mean, I would say, I always start with character when I write my novels, and characters are about history, right? So you sort of have to explore what the history of a character might be, and sort of what got them to the place that they are now, and what components got them to the place that they are now. You can't explore, in a novel, you can't explore someone's entire life, but you can certainly explore some of the big building blocks of it. But so I always start with character. All of the Hester Thursby novels have the same structure. They're told from 4 points of view. Hester usually tells about 40% of the point of the story, and then 3 other characters will split the remaining 60%. And so I try to explore, and as I write, when I first start drafting, I don't know who the other 3 characters are going to be. It comes out in the first draft. And so as I'm exploring sort of that 3-dimensional part of the story, like what's important now, what was important then, who needs to tell which part of the story, that's when I kind of that's when I figure out like where all these pieces are going to, where all these pieces are going to fall. If you could tell me where the pieces are going to fall for my current novel, I would very much appreciate it, because I have not figured it out.
I wish I could. But I have to say, that's one of the things I really enjoy about the books too, and I think it keeps it fresh. When you have a series and a series character, a protagonist like that, and peripheral characters, but also, sometimes you're telling from a point of view who is a character singularly in this book who will not recur. And I think that's one of the things that keeps the series really, really fresh, is like you said, in this book, maybe 40% of it is told from Hester's perspective, which leaves 60% to be told by other people. And so you don't get overwhelmed by her. You don't just live in her perspective. And it's not just that first person story where she tells you what happened from beginning to end, and then that repeats in the next book and the next book. So I think that that's a really cool thing that you do. You don't have to comment on that at all. But the more you talk, the more I said, I think maybe that's, one of the more refreshing elements. But I wanted to ask you too about setting, because I love, when setting sort of becomes its own character in the story. And in these books, we get to learn about, different areas of Boston, but also different parts of New England as a whole. So I was wondering if you can tell me how you think that place enhances plot. And then specifically in this book, how Jamaica Pond, and also sort of a burned out mansion that you saw when you were out running, how you were able to draw on that to populate this book with those kinds of places.
Yeah, setting is so interesting, and you don't, you hear setting as character. When I choose a setting, I want it to sort of match thematically with what the story is. So, like in my first book, this first book was a lot about isolation, and it was also about societal structure and money. And so when I chose the settings for Little Comfort, I wanted to choose places where there was a big gap between rich and poor. And so I set that book in Beacon Hill. Hester and Morgan live in Somerville, so parts of the books are always set in Somerville. But the other settings were Beacon Hill, where you have it's a very historic part of Boston for anyone who hasn't been here. But you have very rich people who live there, and you used to have very poor people who live there. You don't as much anymore. And then I also set it up in the Lakes region of New Hampshire, where again you have very, very rich people who spend the summer there. And then you'll have middle class and poorer people who live there during the year. And you also have rich people who live there all year long. And so I also wanted to, one of the things I love about New England is that you have lots of seasons that you can choose from, but you also have very varied settings that you can choose from that aren't that far apart. I mean, you can get from the ocean to the mountains in an hour here pretty easily. And so for each of these books, I've tried to set them in a different place, but I've also tried to set them in a different season. So the first book was set in winter, the second book was set in fall. This book is set in the very, very beginning of spring, so it's still almost winter, but it's a very, for anyone who lives in Boston, early April is cold and very damp. And so this book, if you notice on the cover, it's a very damp cover. And then the fourth book, when I finally write that one, the fourth book will be set in summer, and I'll move that to, we'll have that set on the Cape, so that'll be fun too. But for this book, I wanted to keep the action in Boston, and I wanted to show an area of Boston that maybe people who don't live here don't know about. And I wanted to sort of have a very urban setting with a lot of greenery around it, with the potential to sort of get outside. These books often take place outside. And so I set it in Jamaica Plain, which is a neighborhood of Boston. There's a park that runs all the way through Boston, a very large park. It's called the Emerald Necklace. And at the center of the Emerald Necklace is a big pond called Jamaica Pond. When I came up with the idea of the family that owns this for-profit school, I wanted them to live in a big, stately house. And Jamaica Plain has lots of big stately houses. And I kept trying to choose one. I kept trying to choose a street. And then, but they just weren't feeling special enough. And so one day I was just like over in Jamaica Plain. I was like, I got to find a place for these people to live. And I was walking around the pond, and I had this memory. I used to live over by Jamaica Pond, and I would go jogging around the pond. And there used to be this burned out house on the banks of the pond. And so I did some research into it, and it turned out that it was this big mansion that had been, so the parks had all been, the parkland had all been reclaimed by the city. And at the turn of the 20th century, Jamaica Pond had been like a summer resort, and there were all these big mansions on it. But when the parkland, when the city reclaimed the land, they tore down all of those houses to build the park. But the designer of the park, Frederick Olmsted, he decided that this one house, he liked that house as part of the design. It was called Pine Bank Mansion. There were a series of fires there. The city used the house for years, but there were a series of fires there. And finally, they had to raise it. But I thought to myself, I'm a fiction writer. I'm just going to have these people live in this house, and I'm going to bring it back to life. And so I had the family who owns the school move into the house. They live right on the banks of Jamaica Pond. And what I really liked about that is I was trying to explore isolation again. One of the characters in particular is very, very isolated by choice. And so she's in this enormous house. She's right in the center of the city. But I liked the fact that it was on the pond. There are no other houses around it. However, she sits in the window and she listens to people in the park. She listens to children playing. She listens to people having fun, and she's completely separate from that out in the middle of this forest, basically. So anyway, that was kind of how I landed on that part of the city this time around.
Sure. No, it's great. I love the settings. I think you do them such justice. I remember, the last book, The Missing Ones, a lot of it, takes place basically on an island, and the ferry runs twice a day. And if you miss the ferry, you're screwed,
Yep.
And you really came to see that as the story, evolves. So I love it. So, okay, I guess if you don't mind, we'll move into broader territory.
Oh, sure.
But I did want to ask you, as a child, you were a book lover, a movie lover from a really young age. So I'm wondering if you can talk about how your reading and your viewing life has informed your storytelling and your writing life.
Oh, sure. I mean, I was a child of the library, and I was also a child of the like Saturday afternoon movie, whatever you would call that thing. So like back in the old days, back before VCRs. on Saturdays they would run movies on Channel 5 at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and I just loved them. I watched them every week. I can still remember certain ones that I watched. And having a huge impact on me. And but my parents would bring us to the library all the time, and we would, get stacks of books and bring them home. So I always loved to read mysteries. I really liked The Three Investigators and a series called The Famous Five, which was set in the UK. And as I grew older, I sort of progressed into Agatha Christie and stuff like that. So I was always reading mystery novels. I loved the idea of the puzzle. I loved the idea of sort of figuring out how all of these pieces came together and sort of backward engineering a lot of these stories. But I also try to bring as much. I was an American Studies major when I was in college. I like to bring a lot of Americana, a lot of movie making, a lot of TV into the series. So that's something that Hester and I share, definitely. We like all of the same things. So like in the first book, one of the things she did to get away from Morgan is she would go up to her own apartment and she'd watch old horror movies on the TV. So there's an homage to The Shining in the first book, if you read it, that you'll definitely see. But she watches other horror movies a lot too. She also loves Law and Order, which I love as well. And then in this book, she's sort of in she's in a more peaceful mode, I guess, or in a more family mode. And so she's obsessed with the Waltons. So she's watching the entire series of the Waltons whenever she wants to get away from Morgan.
Yeah, it's funny. I was, reading the earlier books and, reading a little bit about you. I was like, okay, we have a very similar reading past, and I think we like a lot of the same movies. Too. And in talking about your, background, you've had careers before this, and I wanted to ask you about academic publishing because you worked in that arena for a while. And I'm wondering, first, what inspired you to transition from that to novelist? And also, did you find that the experiences of working in publishing, even though it was, academic publishing and not fiction, was that helpful at all?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so I worked for about 20 years in academic publishing. I worked for Houghton Mifflin first, and then I worked for Macmillan for a long time. And it was super helpful. I mean, I was the editorial director toward the end of my stint. And so, just knowing I know a lot of aspects about bookmaking that your average author isn't going to know. And I also understand the business of publishing a lot, which I hope my own editor appreciates this. But I sort of understand what decisions the editor needs to make. I understand some of the discussions that they have to have with me. And I think it just makes the process easier. I understand the bookmaking process, why things take longer than you want them to. And I also understand what the pieces of the bookmaking process are, which is really helpful as well. I loved working in college publishing. It got to a point where, I had a really big job. I was a vice president. I was the editorial director. I had a lot of people reporting to me. And it gets to a point where if you're having to write a book a year, which is really what I wanted to do as a mystery writer, and run a major division at a large company, it kind of gets to be too much. So eventually I just had to decide which one I wanted to do more, and I decided I would do writing.
Well, we're all glad.
Thank you.
Very happy you made that choice. And I'm sure your editor appreciates too that you do have that sort of business acumen, because I know so many writers who don't have that background and they've sort of been, disillusioned that it is at the end of the day a business and there are business decisions that have to be made. So I'm sure that's very much appreciated. So, all right, another sort of Pandora's box question here, because you also teach. So I want to ask you, in your humble opinion, what is it of writing that can be taught versus what is intrinsic talent? And also, how can, experiencing sort of a workshopping scenario help to maybe balance out those two experiences, somebody who has the talent versus somebody who is really just tenacious and soaks up knowledge like a sponge, even if it doesn't come to them quite naturally.
Sure. I mean, gosh, I could go on about this forever, but a, a couple things that I'll point out. I mean, writing is a skill like anything, and the more you practice something, the better you're going to get at it. So, like anyone who says, "Oh, I can't write," that like anyone can write. If you have an interest in it and you want to keep practicing, you will absolutely get better at it. It may take some time. It may take some people more time than other people, but you can absolutely get better at it. One of the things I like about the workshop process, and this actually relates to my editorial experience as well, is I always say writing is a team sport. You do parts of it by yourself. Parts of it are very individual, but writing ultimately is a team sport. And so one of the things that a workshop really helps teach you to do is how to take information in, how to synthesize that information, how to translate that into your own writing. It also teaches you that not all feedback is feedback that you want to use. This was a great example from a class that I was teaching the other day. The author had handed in a story about a man who was being stalked, and a lot of the students in the class decided they wanted the character who was being stalked to be a woman. And as the workshop progressed, like they kept talking about that character as a woman. It was a good example for me to be able to pull out and say, author who just submitted this story, these people in this class, the other students in this class can say as many times as they want that the character should be a woman, but ultimately only you get to decide that. So you can take that suggestion and say, I'm going to go with it, or you can say, I'm not going to go with that. And I think the workshop really teaches you to be able to parse between what advice you want to take and what advice you don't want to take, because you always get conflicting things in a workshop. I had the third brilliant thing that I was going to say, but now I can't remember what it was.
Happens to me all the time. I feel like all my most brilliant moments are lost, and then nobody ever believes I had them. The truth. I have to say, going back to the scenario that you just gave, I kind of like the idea of having the man being stalked because it seems more familiar that it's typically the woman. So I kind of like the twist on that. So all right, I'm going to ask you this.
You know what? I do remember my brilliant thing that I was going to say.
Oh, excellent.
As far as teaching writing, so I do think there's a big difference between teaching writing when it comes to short story versus long form fiction. And one of the things that I really work with in my courses around long form fiction is coaching people to get to the end. And that's what I would say to anyone who's working on a novel, is just keep going to the end, because there can be a temptation to go back to go over work over and over again and never quite figure out where that story is going to end. And getting to that end is so important, because unless you write the whole thing, you can't fix it.
That is excellent advice. I'm taking all of this in. These are the things, John, that you should listen to when people speak them. All right, so I'm going to ask you too. Obviously, we're living through a pandemic and times are very uncertain. And it's interesting to talk to people, and writers in particular, because, a lot of writers live sort of isolated lives anyway. And so they're used to spending a lot of time alone in their own heads. And maybe it's not so dramatic a change for them as other people. But on the other hand, people who now can't leave the house, even if they weren't going to, just knowing that they can't in the way that they used to can sort of stunt creativity. There's so much anxiety. There's so much, unknown. So I'm wondering, how has the pandemic most changed, your work life, your creative abilities? And if it has, how have you endeavored to sort of try to adapt to this new normal in a way that still allows you to be productive and maybe somewhat sane?
Oh gosh, that's an interesting question too. I mean, I definitely have had my ups and downs, I would say, like everyone, in this last year. I'm officially tired of it. I will tell you that much right now. I mean, it is time for this to be over. So, I am working on a deadline for a book right now. So deadlines are what deadlines are. That means that you kind of have to power through these times. I definitely I've had I've had I've had bursts of incredible creativity in this last year. One of them came as I was waiting for a new contract from my publisher. And so I worked on another project while they were getting the contract together. And that I just put aside because I signed a contract for another book. But I really enjoyed that creative freedom of, there was something freeing about not having a contract. And so I signed the contract, and I'm working on a non-Hester Thursby book right now. It's a standalone book, and I think it'll come together. But my books are always like sort of, because they're the plots are complex and there are always lots of moving parts, lots of moving, as we were talking about, lots of moving timelines, different characters, sort of figuring out how all the pieces fit together. It's sort of like this mad dash to the end. And I do there's this moment where I feel things click, and all of a sudden I kind of see how everything fits together. It hasn't happened with this novel yet. I have every faith that it's going to. And I have a feeling that the fact that it hasn't clicked yet has to do with the stress of the pandemic. So, pandemic, go away.
Right.
Yep.
You said it, just go away. I think we're getting there. All right, final 2 questions for you, and then I'll let you, get back to book 4 and deadlines. What fun. But so in terms of, a creative life or a writing life, for people who are, looking for some thoughtful suggestions, I want to ask you, what is the best advice that you have been given in terms of a creative or writing life? So the best advice you were ever given, and then on the other hand, the best advice that you were never given and you sort of had to learn for yourself and wish that somebody could have told you sooner.
Yep. I was listening to Roxane Gay on the radio one day. I used to do this thing where I would say, I'm going to get up at 5 a.m. and I'm going to work till 7 a.m. This was when I was still working at the publishing house. I'm going to work from 5 a.m. to 7 a.m. every day. And if I got up at 5 a.m. and worked till 7 a.m., I felt awesome. And if I didn't, I felt like a complete failure. But I didn't come up with a plan B for when I didn't do it. And I was listening to Roxane Gay on the radio one day, and the interviewer asked her somewhat similar of a question. They said, I think they asked, do you write at the same time every day? And Roxane Gay, who's very successful, far more successful than I am, said, hell no, I don't have a schedule that permits that. And then she said, but what I do try to do is write every day. And so even if it's just for 5 minutes, and it was just such a nice little shift on what I had been trying to do that had turned into like what I was trying to make into a positive thing had somehow turned negative on some days. And so I was able to say, okay, I didn't make it today it was still my goal to do it from 5 to 7, but I could also do it during lunch for 15 minutes. And that was also writing every day. And so that was good. And I think for anyone who is trying to lead a creative life, set goals for yourself and set goals that work for you. And so if writing once a week is what works for you, that's fine. And if writing 100 words a day is what works for you, that's fine too. Just figure out what works for you. And then as far as something that has never been told to me, I will say that when you're writing, you get a lot of I say this to my students all the time. You get a lot of advice that is absolute. People will say, never write a book with a prologue. Never write a book in the first person. I'm just making these up, by the way. But you know what? And I always say to them, whenever someone says, or always use dialogue tags. I say to them, whenever you get an absolute like that, turn it into consider. So consider using dialogue tags. Consider working your prologue into the body of your manuscript. Those are things that you might consider doing, and they might be a good idea. I'll tell you, I've written 3 books. One of them has 2 of them have a prologues, and one of them doesn't. And it fit the book to have them twice, and it didn't fit the book to have it another time.
Sure, I like that. Consider. That's excellent.
Yeah,
that's advice I've not heard before. Go you. All right, final question. Of course, I have to ask you this, and you've talked a little bit about it already, but you've mentioned that there will be Hester 4, and you also started a standalone book that you're hoping to come back to at some point. So, I'm wondering if you are comfortable with giving us a little bit of a teaser as to what that might be. And if you're superstitious and don't want to, that's fine.
Oh, no, that's fine. In fact, I just came up with a title for it last week with my editor, so I feel even better sharing it. So the book I'm working on right now is set in the Hester Thursby universe, but Hester is not in it. Hester and Morgan are not in. They're going to make a cameo, which I haven't told my editor about yet, but they are going to make a cameo because Angela is in it. Angela has a role in the book, and she just got a VHS tape as a clue, like out of nowhere. She got a VHS tape, and the person who gave it to her said, "Do you have a VCR?" And she says, "No, but I know someone who does have one." And the only person in the world who still has a VHS recorder is Hester Thursby. So she's going to have to go over to Hester's house to watch this tape. So anyway, it's called The Secrets We Share, and it's about two sisters who they live in Boston. One of them is a cop. One of them actually works for Angela White. One of them's a cop, and one of them is a blogger. And she's both a therapist and a baker. And this is sort of like I'm sort of imagining post coronavirus, but she sort of came up with this cookbook that was like a mixture of therapy and baking during this pandemic, and it became, or this blog, and it became a bestseller. So her first book is about to come out, so she's very excited. And just as her book is about to come out, her daughter stumbles upon a dead body that winds up being linked to her, and so there's a little bit of it hits the media, it hits Twitter, and they sort of have to figure out how to deal with that. And then there's also, of course, because I always do this, there's another story that took place in the 90s that is related to this, that sort of plays into some of the decisions that they're making.
Wow, that's a great premise.
I think that's too many words, but I'll have to work on it to make it a little pithier.
That's all right. You got your mind in other places, but that's intriguing. And I guess we'll find out if, all publicity is good publicity. I mean, you have a book coming out, there's a dead body. It's a headline.
We'll find out. We will absolutely find out. Yes.
Awesome. Well, in the meantime, people should pick up Watch Her.
Oh, thank
What's
you.
going to happen? People have probably about a year to kill, but anybody who comes into this series at book 3, they're going to have to go back and read 1 and 2 because they're just that good. So, they have time to catch up. But Edwin Hill, you were terrific. Thank you so much for making time to do this tonight. And I look forward to catching up to Hester's world, even if Hester's only there to provide a VCR. Really does that. But
John, thank you. And I hope we get to see, when this is over, let's go to McAndrews, because I haven't been there in forever.
Yes, let's do that. Plans, things to look forward to. I love it.
Can you imagine?
I know, my social calendar. Zoom, Skype, Zoom. Maybe a Google Hangout.
I know. Well, thank you so much for making the time for me today. I really appreciate it.
That's it for this episode of Central Booking. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a thing.